I can usually talk a lot, but I'm going to talk about something tonight that I've never talked about very much. And even with the people I've talked about it, they only all know parts of the story. Tonight, you're all going to hear all of the story. I want to thank the people here in this room who have walked this walk with me. A very special person's here tonight, and she knows who she is. I came to CR about 15 months ago to support her. I found out that I needed what CR had to offer, and I want to thank her for giving me that opportunity. And for the people here at Barefoot that have accepted me just like I am, I say thank you and I love you all. Shall we open in prayer? Dear God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O God. May the words I have to say flow from my mouth. May it touch somebody's life. May it give them the courage to go forward. May it give someone else the courage to turn over that hurt, hang-up, or addiction, to trust in your everlasting arms for comfort, strength, guidance, to lighten that burden and make it less, to lighten the load. In thy name we pray. Amen. I've titled this The Fairy Tale That Took 50 Years to Live Happily Ever After. I was born to a loving mother and father who met and married despite my maternal grandmother's objections. My mother was a college graduate and a high school teacher, and my father completed 6th grade, having quit school to help his family through the Great Depression. My maternal grandfather was what we called a gentleman farmer, and my paternal grandfather had been a hands-on farmer who had lost it all in the Great Depression. He had moved to the city where he was able to get a job as a furnace tender for an office building. My father was an auctioneer, and he met my maternal grandfather at a livestock auction where my grandfather was the bookkeeper. My maternal grandmother would never forgive him for that introduction. My parents married, despite my maternal grandmother's objections, in a small ceremony with no family present. 3 years later, a boy was born to them, but he died within hours of birth. My mother had fallen during her pregnancy, and that was somehow related to the baby's death. 3 years later, I was born, and by all accounts, they were very happy parents. My mother helped my father in the business. They owned a business called West Kentucky Auto Sales, and they traveled to other auctions on days when they didn't have their own auction, buying and selling cars as sort of a side business. I had a sister born 3 years after me, and our parents employed a nanny to watch us. However, on the morning of March 22nd, 1955, they took me to my maternal grandmother's house, and my sister stayed behind with the nanny. They were traveling to an auction some hours away. They drove separately in cars to that auction, but in coming home, they had sold all but one car, and they were riding together. I can remember my grandmother saying at the time that no news was good news. When the next morning arrived, and my parents had not returned as planned. I was 3 and a half at the time, but I remember bits and pieces of those times in my life. The worst came true when later that day the highway patrol called, and they stated they'd found a car in the river, presumed to be the one my parents were driving. Apparently the highway patrolman, who was supposed to stay and make sure that no one came down the flooded highway that night, thought everyone had gone home, and he went home. An employee of my parents, a black man, could not stop and eat dinner with them because this was the 1950s, and they were stopping at an all-white restaurant. He got through before the highway flooded. Stopping for dinner that night cost my parents their lives. The days that followed were a blur to me. I remember they found my father first, and true to form of those days, he was laid out at home for nearly a week until my mother was found. I was told they'd gone to be with God, and my feelings of abandonment began in earnest. I continued to live with my maternal grandparents, and my sister went to live with a paternal aunt. The years that followed convinced me that my maternal grandparents were not going to be any fun like I had hoped life would be. And I began to really miss those fine people that had gone to be with God. As the years went on, I was angry at God for a long, long time. All I wanted to do was leave this environment and just get away from a very angry grandmother who fussed with my grandfather all of the time. He turned her off and he just didn't answer her. The happiest day I remember was driving away from that whole situation and getting away from this little farm that I lived on. I felt isolated, and this probably led to my first marriage. I met my first husband when I was 15, and my grandfather immediately liked him. A lot of the girls in my class got married right out of high school, and I was no exception. I graduated first in my high school class, and I turned down scholarships to get my MRS degree. The plan was that my husband was to get his degree because if he dropped out of school, well, he'd have to go to Vietnam. And the long litany of jobs that he acquired and quit or lost began shortly after our marriage, and I became the chief breadwinner of the family, a role I maintained until the end of my marriage. I never got back to my education until years after that marriage was over. I began to look for love in all of the wrong places during my first marriage, and our problems began in earnest. We split, we reconciled, and then 7 years into our marriage, a child was born. By that time, I had a job paying a lot more than my husband, and he had taken a job traveling as an auditor. I never got caught in any of my affairs, but he did. And my abandonment set in again very strongly. My grandfather had died when I was 21, and my grandmother died 14 years later after a long, long stay in a nursing home. My first husband and I decided to try and make our marriage work, and 2 more children followed. I had a miscarriage, and the marital problems began again, as did the jobs that my husband started, quit, or got fired. Over time, he became verbally abusive, and our home life was awful. On one particular night, I hit him with a frying pan, a cast iron skillet, in front of my children. A night that was to be a turning point. I knew this couldn't continue. In 1993, I left him after 23 years of marriage, never to return. The months that followed after I ended this marriage could only be described as a nightmare. My phone would ring at 3 a.m. to a drunk begging me to come back. My front door was kicked in, and threats were made on my life, albeit on my answering machine. I eventually went to the police, and I had some warrants issued. I never really enforced those warrants. I used them to finally get my husband at the time to pay the child support in return for not going to jail. 16 months later, the long nightmare of my first marriage ended. I guess my first clue of a problem was when I was 17 and not yet married to him. He tried to run over me with a car. I'd never seen anyone drunk, and I was totally shocked at what drugs did. Things like climbing up on the roof and banging it in the middle of the night, to falling asleep in a bathtub. My sheltered life in the country had totally not prepared me for any of this. I worked in a law firm, and this job had become my life in many ways, most of which were very unhealthy to my marriage. I engaged in an adulterous relationship with my boss. I first tasted alcohol after work with him, and there were many, many things that I would be ashamed for my children to know in the later years. About 6 months after I left my first husband, I went back to an old pastime, bar hopping and drinking, not knowing some nights how I got home, and scared where I had been because I couldn't remember. One of those nights in about the worst bar in town, I found a man who paid attention to me. With that attention, I got a drunk who smoked pot, sipped Bloody Marys with the beer, and was anything but nice. He moved into the house I'd bought, and he told everybody it was his house. The years that followed became a litany of physical abuse. I've had my eyes blackened. I've been thrown out of bed. I've had earrings knocked out of my ears. I've had precious possessions destroyed. I've cried for days on end, unable to function or go to work. He had a ring made for me, and we became engaged. All the while, I put my kids through a really bad situation. This man was controlling, domineering, and absolutely no fun to be around, but I just couldn't end it. He was a retired cop, and he always told me that if I called the police, they'd believe his story, not mine. And when he finished with me and the police, I'd go to jail, and I'd lose my children. Finally, one day, he decided he was tired of my kids, and he wanted to leave. Just recently, I would learn from my daughter that he physically abused both of my younger children. And the reason he left was that he had grown scared that they would report him to the authorities. So he made the decision to leave my home and move out to protect himself. Abandonment set in again when this all ended in October of 2000. Nearly 7 years had gone by. I begged him over and over to keep this unhealthy relationship going. I was working by then as a medical office manager and working part-time as a medical transcriptionist. I was earning a good living. But somehow I had convinced myself that I needed this man to be whole. I made the story look good to others who knew me, but even they suspected there was a problem. Indeed, there was a problem, one that I could not admit. He blamed me for all of his problems, and I was very quick to try to fix them all. I now know the word for that's codependency. At the time, I just felt it was the cost of having a man in my life, and I was scared of being in a house with no man around. I'd never been alone without a man as an adult, and I was scared somehow that I couldn't cope. I'd never learned to be by myself or find activities that I enjoyed. All of the things I had enjoyed had been sacrificed to be with this man. From the time he moved out in August of '99 to October of 2000, I kept running back to this man. I cooked food for him, even though the abuse continued. The only difference now was in that span of time, I had a house to go back to, and he wasn't there. On Christmas Eve of 1999, he threw me out of a moving car, in front of my house, no less. And I vowed I had to get away from him. It took me till October of 2000 to get the courage to do that. I told him it was over, and I vowed there would be no more. I had tried church off and on all my adult life, mostly off. During the years since my first marriage had ended, and prior to that as a married couple, we had attended church somewhat regularly, but I had no real relationship with God to speak of. I taught Sunday school, and I worked in Bible school, because I wanted my kids in church, and every time I would go back, I'd always say I was doing it for them. From October of 2000 to May of 2001, I went back looking for love again. This time, I tried the internet. Having multiple one-night stands with some very unworthy characters. Only by the grace of God am I here today, not having caught something from some of those one-night stands with people whose names I hardly would ever remember. In May of 2001, I met my current husband. I met him on the internet too, but that's a good story. Neither of us had been to church very much. He'd had 2 bad marriages, and I really felt at that point I'd had 2 marriages. He moved in immediately, and we lived together because that's what everybody does, we thought. In December of 2001, he wanted to go and have some business deals. We were going to buy a house or 2 and start renting them. And I said that I wouldn't do that without a ring. Never mind what we were doing was wrong, but I wanted to legitimize the business relationship. Always the businesswoman. At that point, we both kind of had a coming together that we needed to make church a priority. Never mind, we're still talking about church. Nobody said anything about a relationship with God. We're going to go back to church. Gordon's idea at the time is he went to church kind of when he felt like it, and I went when it was convenient. We agreed we were going to make this marriage last. We promised God that, no matter what. There were some rough times, I must admit, with blending 2 families together. But I finally feel that the fairy tale I tried to create did finally have a happy ending. My current husband does not want to this day to talk about this abuse. He knows that I'm giving this tonight, and when I asked him if that was all right with him, he changed the subject so quick that we hardly got a yes out of him. I actually feared for a long time that if I told him where my abuser lived, that he might go hurt him. And I'm not too sure that he might not do this to that very day. So to this point, he doesn't know where my abuser lives, even though he knows it's close to where we used to. He was quick to point out that he would never hurt me. But every time he raised his voice in the early years of our marriage, I would get scared of what was going to happen next, because every time somebody yelled at me, usually other things followed. It took several years before we had a meeting of the minds that there would be no more voice raising in our house. I had to establish boundaries, which had always been a hard thing for me to do. But it's been so worth it. I vowed I would not and could not ever allow anyone to again push, shove, or yell unmercifully at me. Just when I thought things were going along well, God had more plans in store that I hadn't written into my story. My stepson took too many pills, and he died. Another problem came into our marriage, the loss of a child. And then, right before Ben's untimely death, my husband had been working in Germany. He's an aviation contractor. He works on airplanes and helicopters. He had gone to Germany on a 90-day temporary duty assignment. We'd both agreed on that, and he was going to go. He was going to see Germany and make a little extra money, and he was going to come home. Sounded like a good plan. And about 2 weeks before he was due to come home, and at that point about a month before Ben's death, he called and said, we had a conversation I'll never forget. He said, I think I'm going to stay. And I said, you're going to do what? And he said, I think this is an opportunity for us to get financially stable. You know, we've had some rough spots, and I'm going to put my paperwork in. In fact, it's already ready, but I'm just waiting to talk to you to stay. So the way this all works is he had to come home for the paperwork to be put in front of the German government for him to stay on a permanent job. And in that 65 days he was home, about 30 days into it, Ben killed himself. Or overdosed. We'll never know whether it was accidental or suicidal. We believe it was suicidal. Also, about a month before Gordon had told me he was going to stay, I had a worsening of heart problems. I had always had some minor chest pains. I had taken some diet pills years before so I could be just what my abuser wanted me to look like. And if any of you know anything about fen-phen, it has some heart issues. I was a fen-phen victim. And my blood pressure went up to 6 digits and wouldn't go down. That had all kind of calmed down, but while Gordon was in Germany, I had some other issues, some shortness of breath, and the doctors did some of those scary tests where they inject you with stuff and you run on a treadmill and they take pictures of your heart. And I ended up in GW with a cardiac angiogram, all by myself, I felt. And I was convinced I was going to die right there on the spot. I made some lifestyle changes. I never required stenting. My blockages never got any worse, and by God's grace, I learned a lot about myself and reacting to stress. I worried so bad about all of this and how it would negatively affect my children as the years went on. This domineering man had distanced me from my oldest son, and I missed out years of his life, years I cannot take back. My oldest boy is a big guy, and I later would learn that the reason my abuser wanted him out of our relationship was that he was afraid he would hurt him, and he probably would have. But he, as I said, he and I have reconciled, and we're closer than ever. My youngest son says that all of this has taught him what a man's not supposed to do, and that his stepdad has taught him what a man is supposed to do: to go to work, to take care of his family. The moral of this story is to all ladies that you know who are in a bad situation: get away from him. It's not natural to have your eyes blackened and your body bruised. It's far less embarrassing to admit it's over than to go back and get more hurt. God asks us to forgive those who have wronged us, and I found this particularly difficult. I would say I was forgiving, and then something would come up in my life, and I was right back to that spot again, angry with the same old things. In the years since my second marriage in 2001, my husband and I have rededicated our lives to God's work. I have a personal relationship with God, the same God I was angry at. And I can't wait to serve Him every day that He gives me on this earth. I have 2 children in the military, one who's currently serving in Afghanistan tonight. and a daughter who just returned from Iraq. And my husband's in Kandahar, Afghanistan tonight as well. See, that little trip to Germany led to other trips. I'm 3 lessons away from completing a 12-step program that I began last year. With CR's help, I have not felt the abandonment like I used to. I know I'm forgiven, and I know that He wiped it off the slate. I know that we aren't just to ask forgiveness to God, we're to confess our sins to our fellow man. He put some wonderful people in my path to share that journey with, and a good number of them are here tonight. We serve an awesome God who can take broken pieces and put them back together. If we'll just let Him have control. If we'll just commit our lives to Him, we'll just get in God's Word every day and make serving Him a priority in our lives. Hebrews 12:1 tells me to run the race that God has set before us with endurance. And I really feel that I finally found the course of that race in seeking God's will first in my life. Thank you for your time tonight.